There have been a few times in my life when I got an idea to do something, and my immediate reaction was, no, I will not do that. And inevitably, the idea won't go away. And so I've come to the point where I think if my initial reaction is no, then it's probably something I'm just going to have to do, whether I want to or not. This talk falls into that category. When I first got the idea, it was going to be called Preparation for Martyrdom. And I thought, no, that's just too awful. Nobody would come. So I negotiated with myself, or God, I don't know which. And I finally came up with Preparation for Persecution, which doesn't sound quite so awful. But I didn't want to do this talk, and I resisted, and then I just finally gave in. And I was giving a different talk. I'll share with you this one. Some of you may have heard it. Conquering Corrupt Culture by Raising Christian Communicators. And I had done this for many, many years. And the last time I did it, I think it was in Houston, I got the idea to do this as an extension off that. I didn't want to do it. But the extension came from this book. Now, this is a book that someone gave me a long time ago. It's called Raising Them Right by, no less than, Theophan the Recluse. Now, you would wonder, what would a guy named Theophan the Recluse know about raising children? He doesn't sound like your typical dad. Well, he evidently lived in the 1800s. He was an Eastern Orthodox monk, theologian, hermit who wrote voluminously. And this book is a collection of some of his writings, fairly small book, about educating children. And it's a very hard book to read, I'll be quite honest. His argument is very simple. Premise one, the purpose, the end, the teleos, the sole reason for educating children is the cultivation of appetites or attitudes. That in the end, when kids leave our control and go out to live their lives, the most significant, if not the only really, really important thing that they take with them is their appetites, their desires. What do you want in life? Because that will affect every decision that you make. And his second premise is that the appetites of a Christian should be to follow Christ. Okay, I can accept that. So far, so good. Unfortunately, the third statement is that to follow Christ is to embrace service, selflessness, sacrifice, and suffering, even unto death. And that is the whole purpose and end of educating children. Well, I didn't like this book because I realized I am not good at living a life of selfless service, sacrifice, and suffering. Actually, my appetites are quite different. I'm okay with service as long as you get paid. Selflessness, well, that's just part of getting married, so, it's worth it. But when you get into sacrifice and suffering, these are not on my to-do list, right? My appetites are very different. I will tell you my appetites. First-class upgrades, temperature-controlled, comfortable environments, healthy, expensive food, and enough money in the bank to not worry too much for a while. I am so far from that ideal that I hated this book because I thought, I have no idea how to help my children learn this when I myself have no capacity for it. But I kept mentioning the book, I kept thinking about it, and I thought, well, I'm not really forced to do any of that stuff. So it's hard. I'm way too comfortable. Everybody I know is way too comfortable. But since I started doing that talk, well, 15, 17 years ago, things have changed. Things have changed. And I noticed a few kind of in the process where my brain was working on, am I really going to do this talk on persecution and martyrdom? There were a few things that urged me in that direction. And they were mostly news type items that came across my screen. Well, now we get 100 things across the screen every day, right? Most of them, it's just delete. You have to spend like 10 minutes of your day just deleting stuff that you don't want to look at, that you're not going to read. But a few of these things caught my eye. This caught my eye February 2nd. Record number of Americans report being unhappy. Okay, unpack that a little bit. Well, it says that for the past 5 decades, around 1 in 10 Americans said they are not happy in their day-to-day lives. Okay, I guess I could believe that. However, in 2021, the number skyrocketed with 1 in 4 Americans saying that they are not happy. Well, now, that's pretty significant because if you're just talking about 1 in 10, well, they can just go be unhappy. It's not going to change the world. But when you're looking at 1 in 4 being unhappy, that's a level of dissatisfaction and unhappiness that could have consequences. And then reading a little more, you discover that the number of Americans describing themselves as very happy fell from 31% to 19%. Every age group, but the most unhappy people are young people. Their unhappiness doubled from 16% to 30%. And the number of happy young people declined from 25% to 14%. And of course, this does not surprise me, people who are married were 3 times more likely to report being very happy, which right there is a good reason everyone should get married, right? It protects you against unhappiness. Statistically speaking, I'm sure there are anomalies. But I kind of just thought, all right, that's a significant change. If you're walking around and 25% of the people are unhappy, that's going to have some consequences. Okay, this next one came. This was a little bit earlier, January 13th. Democratic voters support harsh measures against unvaccinated. Okay, this was Rasmussen report. So this is a reliable polling organization. This is not a biased news outlet or something. Okay, nearly half, 48%, of Democratic voters think federal and state governments should be able to fine or imprison individuals who publicly question the efficacy of the existing COVID-19 vaccines on social media, television, radio, or in online or digital publications. Okay, now whatever your opinion about vaccines is, kind of irrelevant. The idea that half of Americans, about 25% or 1 in 4, think that the government should be able to fine or imprison you for publicly questioning something, well, that's a pretty big shift. Then it gets a little more disturbing. 47%, so about half, the Democrats, favor a government tracking program for those who won't get the vaccine. This last point, though, this was the one that set me harsh. 29%, so that's a little under a third of half, so about a sixth of the people, would support temporarily removing parents' custody of their children if parents refuse to take the COVID-19 vaccine. And this is way back at the beginning of this year when our understanding of that was, albeit I think a little more fuzzy and polarizing. But I thought, 1 in 4 of the people would favor harsh government reaction to basically free speech. And I thought, well, it's probably the same 25% that are unhappy. Right? I mean, probably. But this idea of temporarily removing parents' custody, that struck me as being really a harsh and frightening idea. All right, then I put this little picture there just because it was funny. It says, Bill Gates can keep his poison, I'm homeschooled, no mandates, or something like that. I don't know if this is a good advertisement for homeschooling or not, but okay, now this one kind of hit me hard right around the same time. And this is from Barnabas Aid, which is a group. I suppose I got on their mailing list. Maybe I gave them some money once upon a time. I don't know. But I get their emails, and it's basically news of Christians in the Middle East. So here's the headline: Pakistani Christian pastor shot dead near Peshawar. Okay, who cares? Honestly, that kind of thing happens all the time. Why should I care about a Pakistani pastor shot dead in Peshawar? I'm not even sure where Peshawar is. It was the next part that got me. I praise God and am so proud that I am the daughter of a martyr and the wife of a martyr too. That's this guy's daughter, this guy's wife. So her husband and her father were both killed, murdered for their faith. And then also the brother. I praise and thank God that I belong to a family of martyrs. And I sat there and stared at this, and I thought, I do not have the capacity to think that way. If someone killed one or more of my children or my wife or someone who I love, just shot them down because they were Christians, I do not know that I have anywhere in me the capacity to say, thank God. There would be anger, there would be resentment, there would be all sorts of emotions, but it would not be gratitude. And I realized how far I am. I do a lot of talking at homeschool conventions, and probably one of the most common conversations that I have with people is they get into homeschooling and they're a little bit concerned about whether their kids are going to be, after homeschooling, able to get into college and get a good job and basically have a nice, comfortable life. That somehow that's the most important thing in this conversation about curriculum and homeschooling. And I thought, man, the early Christians did not sit around thinking about, how do I educate my children so they can get to a good college and have a comfortable, easy life? No! The early Christians, they had to educate their children to die for their faith. And I just thought, I do not even know how to begin to think this way. But there are some clues that maybe I should start thinking this way. And then I go to a pretty traditional church. We sing hymns. That's where you have a book and not a PowerPoint, and they have like substance. So right around the same time, this all happened January, February. It's all mushed together in my brain, and I'm debating whether I want to go here. Okay, here's a hymn. Faith of our fathers living still in spite of dungeon, fire, and sword. Oh, how our hearts beat high with joy whenever we hear that glorious word. Faith of our fathers, holy faith, we will be true to thee till death. Okay, that's easy. Those guys died, and now I'm happy and comfortable because of it. But the next verse kind of, it poked me in the ribs here. Our fathers chained in prisons dark were still in heart and conscience free. How sweet would be their children's fate if they, like them, could die for thee. Okay, that's a shift, isn't it? How sweet would be my children's faith if they could die for Christ. So, I've been thinking about things. You probably have too. We have seen in recent years tremendous activity of things that appear to be not good. We see them in the schools. We see them very much in the media. We see them politically. We see them sometimes in our neighborhoods. We've got the LGBTQIA agenda. We went through the whole Black Lives Matter period and the violence, and then the critical race theory being pushed really heavily in schools. We see kind of the cancel culture. This isn't ending. People are getting canceled. One I just saw yesterday, this woman, she's old, really old, because when she was a child, she was in a Nazi concentration camp. That's old. She's arrested for praying outside an abortion clinic. And it said FBI. I don't know if that's true. We had COVID. There were fears. There were lockdowns. There was government control that was way beyond anything we've experienced. Justifiable or not, it happened. And we got off easy. I don't know if you looked at what was going on in some of the other countries, places like Australia and New Zealand. Vaccine mandates, passports, this expansion of authoritarianism. And now we have this economic uncertainty. It's like everybody knows things can't just keep going the way they are forever. Something's gonna break. And yet we keep operating as if everything was just gonna keep going the way it is. We have this surveillance society. Just last night, I saw this very interesting article about young people in Europe who are using really weird, strange makeup on their faces. Like really strange. Not makeup, but like clown level, jarring face painting. Do you know why? It outsmarts the facial recognition software that's ever present in their world. Most people don't even think, don't even know. And then, of course, there's Canada. I know people who have literally said, I had to leave Canada, and I don't know if I'll ever go back. I escaped Canada. Canada was like our happy little brother at one point, right? And now we have World War III. So, what's next? One of the most important books of the year, this actually came out in 2020, Live Not by Lies by Rod Dreher. Has anyone read this book? Yeah, it's a pretty important book. I'd put it on the top list of disturbingly important books to read, or importantly disturbing, depending on how you want to phrase your adverbs. So Rod Dreher, I've read all his books. He took the title for this book. It was the title of an article written by Solzhenitsyn. It was the last thing Solzhenitsyn wrote before he was exiled from the Soviet Union. And this book, I will tell you, is a rough read. He started researching the book because he was meeting people who lived through the Soviet era, whose parents lived through the Nazi era, who have firsthand family experience of persecution, active imprisonment and torture level persecution. And they all said to him, what happened to us is exactly what's happening right here and right now in this country, in this modern world. So he draws some interesting parallels. He points out ways in which we can see very clearly elements from the novel 1984. The memory hole, the cancellation of any news that would be contrary to Big Brother, the idea of total control over the dissemination of information. And then he also draws parallels between Brave New World by Huxley. And those are two really interesting books to read in tandem because in 1984, the Big Brother government controls everyone by force, And in Brave New World, they don't have to, because everyone capitulates to a life of complete comfort and pleasure, and there's no need to control people through force because they allow themselves to be totally controlled happily. And then the one character, of course, in the book who doesn't like that, nobody can understand. Why wouldn't you want to live this marvelous, perfect, comfortable, easy, filled with continuous pleasure life? And it's interesting because he's asked, so what you want is the right to be unhappy? And he said yes, because that's what freedom is about. He also draws some very clear parallels between the Nazi era, the control of media and propaganda, the capturing of young people and indoctrinating them at a young age for a political end. And then he points out that we have some elements of the Soviet period where there's a surveillance society, there's everyone's very nervous because, the neighbors are all spying, and there's this massive intelligence network that's tracking everyone. And that was before they had real technology. So by the end of this book, by the end of the first half of this book, you're pretty depressed. In the second half of the book, however, he went to Eastern Europe and he interviewed Christian families who had lived through the Soviet era, whose parents had lived through the Nazi era, with this question: how did you survive with your faith and your family intact? And the answers to those questions are in the second half of this book. So I highly recommend it, but don't stop in the middle. Because if you do, you will get the feeling. 1984, Brave New World, Nazi Germany, Soviet bloc, you are here, right now. Well, okay. Some people may feel that way. Other people may just feel like that. This is it. This is the apocalypse. This is the four horsemen. Finally, it's happened. But people have thought that forever. I'm sure the people in Germany thought that had to be the end of the world, and Hitler had to be the Antichrist, and there was no hope, no future, right? So we don't know, but you can have the feeling. So my question then is, if we're in this situation, which I think we all would agree is very different than 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 decades ago for our life. Things are just very different now. And if you've lived long enough, you can have that feeling, and it's a little more powerful. You young people, not necessarily so much. How do we get ready? How do we prepare? How do we keep living our life as though things are just going to go on the way they are, while at the same time realizing they probably are going to change radically and not necessarily for the better? So this was my question. Now, one thing that I think is important for us to know a little bit about is, how did this happen, right? How did we get into this situation? So a very useful book is this, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman. He's a professor at Grove City College, I believe. He's a philosopher, but this is philosophy light. I always read philosophy light. I don't want to read real philosophy. I just want to read people telling me about philosophy. He wrote an even shorter version of this too. I don't remember, it was Strange something. But in this book, he basically says, okay, it all started in the early 18th century early 19th century, 1800s, the Romantic poets, Shelley, Wordsworth. This was where you saw the beginnings of the intellectual acknowledgement of the dissatisfaction with traditional family, marriage, romance life. Like, we can't be truly fulfilled human beings if we are constrained by the whole concept of monogamous marriage. We're just never going to be fulfilled. And therefore, we have to challenge that, right? And that was really kind of the first time that it entered into the intelligentsia, the world of high literature. And of course, things always do that. They start in the world of intelligentsia, and then gradually they sink down into popular awareness. And so I never would have thought that. You think of Wordsworth, wow, wasn't he a great poet? I don't know, never read it. Then, of course, and these are not necessarily in chronological order, but they all are confluent during that time period. You had Nietzsche, who began to essentially note that human beings were rejecting God, rejecting truth, rejecting absolutes, and that may or may not be a good thing, but look at that. God is dead. Right? We don't need him. And that combined with Rousseau. Rousseau was one of those people who was pretty much unhappy about everything. And so he built on this idea that, you're just going to be profoundly unhappy if you operate under these constraints of Judeo-Christian morality. And the only way that humans can achieve happiness is to put off the shackles. And this was strengthened, if you will, by the whole Enlightenment period, which was supported very much by Darwinism. And that was the redefinition of man. Not necessarily Darwin, but Darwinism, right? So this idea that humans are not a special creation. We are an evolving animal. We came from some other form, and now we have reached the point in evolution where we can take control of our own destiny. We can make ourselves better. And this then was the essentially rejection of the fact that we need God to become better. Because, well, we're an evolving animal. The soul is a myth. The soul isn't even a real thing. It's all the mind. And then you had modern psychology. Freud was a big turning point here as well, because Freud came up with this theory that all human behavior is motivated by sex. That everything we do from our earliest age is a result of our sexual drives. And again, we cannot be truly happy if these are stifled in any way. And then you had the marriage, you had the rise of Marxism, which was this theory. All of human history is based on class struggle. And the only way that we can be free and happy as humans is to eliminate classes so that we can all be equal. And then we will be happy. Now, Marxism took its original form as economic class struggle. So there was the rich and the poor, and the rich have always oppressed the poor, and the only way that the poor can be happy is to eliminate the rich. And that failed. That failed so miserably that there are very few people over the age of about 30 right now that would not agree. Economic Marxism failed. We still see vibrant examples of that in places like North Korea today. We see the shadows of it all over Eastern Europe. The history is not distant. But since economic Marxism failed, now we have the marriage of Freud and Marx. And so now we have sexual Marxism. This idea that we are all oppressed or oppressors based on our sexuality and our beliefs about sex. So he kind of traces all this in this book. It's very good reading. It's well written. You can follow it. He gives a lot of direct, references and quotations, so you feel like it's the real deal. And he basically says what we have here is the rise of the psychological and therapeutic self. Who we are is determined by our psychology and our needs, our physical and emotional needs. And that is how we define ourselves these days. Okay, so that's that book, and I think it's a good starting point to kind of understand how a lot of people are thinking and where it all came from. They don't know this is why they're thinking that, but this is how it developed. Another very important book, and this was some years ago, this was at least 7-8 years ago, The Coddling of the American Mind by Lukianoff and Haidt. Now they, unlike Truman, they are not Christian writers. They actually are kind of, have been leaning liberal, kind of the classical liberal types. They teach at universities. But the subtitle here, The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. And in this book, they talk about the 3 great untruths. And I strongly recommend that you read this book aloud with any kids that you are thinking of sending off to a college or university anywhere. Because their argument is you cannot go to a college or university, even a small private Christian school, without being indoctrinated into these 3 great untruths. Because even if the curriculum and the professors aren't indoctrinating you, all of your peers believe this. So here's the first one. The untruth of fragility. If it doesn't kill you, it will make you weaker. All right, so that is the opposite of what Nietzsche said, which is if it doesn't kill me, it will make me stronger. This is untrue at a cellular level. You know, it's very interesting. I've learned a new word as the result of my new interest. And my new interest is health and fitness and nutrition and longevity. Why? Because I would like to see my grandchildren grow up, get married, and see their children. And I would like to swim and play chess with my great-grandchildren. But to do this, I'm going to have to live long enough. The word is hormesis. Hormetic would be the adjectival form. What does it mean? If it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. Controlled hormesis. This is true at a cellular level. David Sinclair, in his book, Lifespan, Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to, he talks about yeast cells. When you deprive yeast cells of nutrition at a certain level, they live longer. Every study done with rodents, if you restrict their calories and increase their exercise, you can also use heat and cold, artificial hormesis. You make their life tougher, guess what? They live longer. One of the things that has always mystified me is people who can spend years and years in prison camps with severe, what you would consider severe hardship, malnutrition, beatings, things that should destroy and weaken a body, and they're living to be 95 years old. Not all of them. Some of them died. But this idea, and so what happens now is you've got people who say, oh no, if we invite this speaker who will offend me because of the way I perceive myself, that's going to hurt so much, we can't allow him to speak on our campus, in our environment, right? Lukianoff and Haidt are of the old school liberal idea, which is, well, university campuses should be places where there's a free exchange of ideas. The second great untruth is the untruth of emotional reasoning. Most young people believe this. Trust your feelings. What's the truth here? No, you're stupid if you trust your feelings, because guess what? You get angry, you get sad, you get irritated, you get ecstatic, you get hungry, you get tired. You have a range of feelings all day long, and if you make decisions at those moments of being angry or sad or happy, or you could very easily make a bad decision. What are we supposed to do? Use our brain, use logic, use reason, think things through. Don't react. Give yourself time. This is the ancient philosophy. This is the core of Stoicism. Use your mind. But no, if it makes me feel bad, It's evil. The untruth of us versus them. Everyone is either good or bad. This is profoundly dangerous. And Lukianoff and Haidt did not say this in their book, but I'm going to say it now. This is the result of the denial of the existence of sin. So what happens is someone thinks, well, there's no such thing as sin, and I am good because I believe I am good and I'm trying to be good. And someone who disagrees with me, therefore, must be bad. Furthermore, I am all good, so they must be all bad. So if we disagree on something, then that just defines them as being bad, and we must eliminate that. Chesterton said, of course, what's wrong with the world? I am. It's my sin that is the problem in the world. And if you can't acknowledge that in yourself, then you lose the reality of what humanity is, and you fall into traps like that. So, very important book and highly recommended, especially if you're about to send a young person off into a university or college environment. So, I have a proposal that we should prepare ourselves and our children for persecution. We will have a choice. We will have a choice at some point to either capitulate or resist. We need somehow to prepare ourselves to suffer the consequences if we're going to stand for truth. And so they may be very mild. They also may be very harsh. I have spent the year searching for and reading books by or about people who suffered for their faith or suffered for a political ideal, sometimes very, very harshly. I finished a book called Against All Hope by Armando Velardes. He was imprisoned in Castro's Cuba for over 20 years. He suffered the worst persecution. He was beat. He was starved. He was sick. He tried to escape and he was beat more. And all he would have had to do to get out of that is to accept re-education. And he refused. For 20 years he suffered. And it is so interesting to read his story and think, okay, what was it that allowed him to do that? Why would he do that? Why? I would probably just say, yeah, re-educate me. I'm done. I can't handle the pain. I'm a wimp. But what's interesting, his story and other stories like him, is that the more he resisted and the harsher the circumstances he endured, the more able he was to continue to resist, the stronger he became. Spiritual hormesis, if you will. But we need integration. We need to think about our mind and our body and our soul. And I have come to realize that you cannot really strengthen one of these without strengthening them all. It's very, very difficult to be strong in your mind if you're not also physically strong. And sometimes one will feed the other. You grow and strengthen your mind, and then you grow physically and spiritually, or you grow physically and then you benefit mentally and spiritually, or you go spiritually and you become stronger. So they're completely integrated. So I have a few ideas to share with you on what this might look like. And here's the good news. Let's say that everything gets better. Let's say there's a revival and we don't see an active persecution of Christianity in the 21st century in the West. I think it's unlikely, but it's possible. So let's say it happens. and we got all ready by becoming tough and prepared, we'll be better off for it. We'll be happier. So, if persecution never happens, we still benefit from having prepared for it. So what does that look like? Well, the first thing I would point out is physical preparedness. I think Americans are distinctly, and I would put myself in this category, wimps. We are very, very unable to tolerate discomfort. We are very, very out of shape in the broadest sense of things. And there is an ancient tradition of fasting and using exercises and sacrifices to become physically and spiritually stronger. And I have personal experience with this because of some changes that I made with this idea of not eating food for periods of time. I cannot tell you how strengthening it is. And yet, most of us don't regard this as an important aspect of our getting better or growth. But, if you look, almost every, what he said in this book, well, there's a book, Eat, Fast, Feast, there it is. He said, every religious tradition, with the exception of Zoroastrianism, I don't know how to figure that out, has traditional disciplines of fasting for spiritual strength. We know that if you endure heat or cold, guess what? Your metabolism improves. Your mitochondria grow healthier. Your immune system is strengthened. But who really wants to go sit in a 190-degree sauna for 15 minutes? It's hell, or close to it. Or get into very cold water, or even take cold showers, right? But, what if we had to suffer that down the line? Wouldn't we be better off for having learned a little bit how to do that now? Going without stuff. We don't even relate to this anymore. This book, Eat, Fast, Feast, I highly recommend it. It's a Catholic author, but I don't think he's irritatingly Catholic to anyone. It's just his faith. But he talks about the traditions of fasting, the mechanics of fasting, and how to leverage that into the spiritual benefits of fasting. It's a very balanced, very good book. Highly recommend it. We also know that, if you're gonna survive hardship, it's better to be stronger. And again, most of us are not really doing things every day to get stronger. Well, I got some bad news for you. As you get older, if you don't get stronger, you will get weaker. And there's no way around it. So there's just so many benefits of thinking ahead on that. I realized if things got really, really bad, and I have a hard time imagining what that would actually look like, but let's say things got really bad and I'm still alive, I would like to be one of the people who can help, rather than being one of the people who needs help. Even breathing. Most of us do not breathe consciously. We don't learn how to breathe. We don't practice breathing. And it's something you can learn. Just go to YouTube. You don't even have to buy a book. You can learn so much about how to control your diaphragm and you improve your body temperature and your circulation, your metabolism, just by breathing better. Anyway, I could go on and on. The last thing is, in our children in particular, today's generation do not do very well with delayed gratification. Actually, none of us do, right? What we want is what we want now, right? And there's even a chant. What do we want? Blah, blah, blah. When do we want it? Right now. It's a bunch of whining people out on the streets. Well, anything worth having is worth working for, and it takes time. And so this book, The Boy Crisis by Warren Farrell, this, I would say, it's on the top 5 most important books in print today. It is so impactful. And, when I read it, I understood myself better. I understood my father better, even though he's passed on. I understood what my wife thinks about me. I understood my son. I understood all my daughters. I understood every boy in the world. I understood everything in the whole world better because I read this book. And Warren Farrell, he's a fascinating man, really fascinating, PhD, psychologist. But he says the number one predictor of success for boys is the ability to have delayed gratification. That is the number one predictor. Well, why? What do you have to do? Work hard. Why? Because the benefits will show up down line. And really, he didn't say it, but that's like all of life is delayed gratification, right? You didn't suffer your whole life. Why? Why even live? Why not just kill yourself now if it's all suffering? You have to have the spiritual perspective. You have to look at the life of Jesus and other great martyrs who said, I will suffer because love wins in the end. So, those are a few thoughts. Now, I had this question, and I don't know, some of you might have participated in my informal Facebook poll, but I had this question and I thought to myself, okay, let's say, for purposes of argument, that you lost everything, right? You were persecuted, you lost your bank account. You were frozen up by JP Morgan. Or you just lost all your money. Or maybe you lost your home. Maybe you lost your car. You couldn't even go anywhere. Let's say the ultimate horrible thing happened and you had no phone. Or, even worse than that, all that happened and you're in prison. All right, this does not seem impossible to me. What would you have left? What would you have left? Well, the answer came when I saw this. Here's a headline. Eau Claire North High School staff member displays LGBTQ poster that states, I'm your mom now. So there's the poster. This is a picture of a high school in nice little friendly conservative Eau Claire, Wisconsin. It says, if your parents aren't accepting of your identity, I'm your mom now. #FreeMomHugs. You can go find out what that is if you want. Okay, what's so significant about that? Identity. If you have nothing, all you have is who you are. It's your identity. How do you define yourself? This poster wants to force everyone to define themselves in that way. I argue we have to learn how to identify ourselves correctly. And not only that, we need to learn how to teach our children. Because if we don't teach our children how to define themselves, to understand their identity correctly, the whole world will do it for them. And it won't be properly ordered. It's kind of funny. If you were to ask me who I am, right? And I started to tell you about myself, trying to define myself for you, the very last thing that would possibly occur, and might not even occur to me, is to tell you that I am a white, heterosexual, cisgendered, middle-class American male. That wouldn't even be on my screen of who I am. And yet, the whole world would identify me in exactly that way. And at this moment, that's one of the worst things you could possibly be. So it's identity. So my thought is, okay, start with the big questions. Are you a created being, or are you an accident of the universe? That is everything right there. That is the point of demarcation. Because if you start with, I am a created being, everything flows from that. It means there's a creator. And if you say, no, I am an accident of the universe, there is no creator, everything flows differently. That is the most important thing. And that is the ultimate evil of Darwinism, is to deny the existence of a creator, because it undermines everything about how we perceive ourselves and who we believe ourselves to be. If you're created being, by whom and for what purpose? What are my most important relationships? Identity is always in relationship, right? So I could say, oh yes, I'm in a white, heterosexual, cisgendered male. Well, that's in relation to other things, right? So what are the most important relationships? And knowing that, what must I do? Because our action depends on our relationship. Which leads me to this idea of code and creed. And this is where we get into the curriculum idea. Code. What's a code? Rules, precepts, laws, right? The things you do define who you are. This goes all the way back. You look at the Old Testament. What was the first thing God gave his people? The law, the code, the things to do. It preceded why to do them, right? Do this and this and this, and don't do that, and you will be my people. Don't do and do the things that are opposite to that, and you have basically cut yourself off. You are no longer in relationship there, right? And then we have the creed. That's what we believe, what we know, right? And the creed and knowledge informs our ability to follow the code. This is very embedded in our culture. So if you were to ask me, Andrew Pudewa, who are you, right? I would probably try to go in a hierarchical order and say, well, the first thing I know is I'm a created being. The second thing I would say is I am a follower of Christ. That adds now, that adds more to the code I have to follow. It is very hard to follow Christ. The code is strict. The way is narrow. I fail most of the time, but I do not give up. I am a member of a church. That adds code. That adds precepts. Because I'm a member of the church, I do certain things and don't do other certain things. Then I would go down into my relationships. I'd say, well, the next most important thing is I'm a husband. Right? I have a spouse. This defines who I am, and there are rules associated with this. If I break the rules, I break the relationships. I am a son. My parents are both passed on, but I still have that relationship, and there's a code of behavior. I am a parent. There's certain things I do and don't do because I'm a parent. I'm a grandparent. I'm a citizen, right? I'm a teacher. I'm a student. I am a friend. And so we have these things. We have these contracts and policies and promises and pledges and obligations. And when we're afraid of those things, our identity starts to wither. Well, you look at it. Okay, created being, 10 commandments, books of the law, commands of Christ, precepts of the church. What do you do when you get married? You stand before witnesses and you make promises of how you will live. We even have stuff like the Code of Chivalry. I love Washington's Rules of Civility. Have you ever read those? It's readily available. He's like, how to be a good person according to George Washington. It's pretty tough, but it's useful. Even our country, right? We have a constitution. Why? Because that defines who we are, right? Other countries don't have that. They don't have the same reverence for laws. You look at things like the Scout Pledge, right? A school, I was in a mall So I was in South Carolina and I discovered that I had left my power adapter for my computer and I was really irritated. And I thought, man, I'm going to have to pay the stupid tax because I got to have a power adapter. So I conveniently was near a mall. I went to the mall because there was an Apple store. I thought, okay, this will be expensive but quick. I walked into the mall in Greenville, South Carolina. This blew me away. The first thing on a poster, a sign, on a stand, right there, you walk in the front door, and there it is, Code of Conduct. For the mall. Like, this is how you be a shopper in the mall. There's a code. Some of you are familiar, I would guess, with Jordan Peterson. Why is this guy so phenomenally popular? Why has his book sold so many copies? Because what's his antidote to chaos? 12 rules for life. People are craving code. Creed is, of course, knowing what you believe. And you know what you believe because you keep telling yourself, right? And guess what? If you don't keep telling yourself, you may forget. There are a lot of people walking around who have forgot what they believe because they don't remind themselves. Some religious traditions will recite every single time, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, maker of all things visible and invisible. Why would you sit around and say the same thing week after week after week, or some people day after day after day? Why? Because you need that so deep. You need that belief so deep that if everything were stripped from you and you were suffering torture, you wouldn't forget. And we have these. We have the Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek. These are the things we believe. We have catechisms, Protestant, Catholic. What are these? These question and answer forms that we learn so that we know what we believe. We even have it as a nation, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Even in the Pledge of Allegiance, we believe one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Well, let's get that out of the way because we don't want to believe that anymore, because obviously there are some people who don't live up to it. Therefore, we should trash it. You know, one of the saddest things is the misunderstanding of ideals, right? Oh, ideals that you can't live up to are bad. Give me a break. What would you have if you didn't have any ideals? Nothing to strive for, no goals. You'd be dead in spirit. So how do we build this in ourselves, in our students, in our children, in our families, in our culture, in our communities? Well, culture is such a great word. I love this word so much. I love it because it has analogous meanings. And as you unpack it, it starts to make more sense. So you think of culture. Okay, what is it? Most people say culture. Well, that's the books and the movies and the art and the music and the architecture and the clothing and all the stuff of life. Okay, that's true, but that's only one aspect of it. We also have the term culture as in corporate culture, right? That would be kind of the way we do things around here. So we have a company, we have a corporate culture. We try to do things a certain way to give certain benefits to all of us, right? Your family has a corporate culture. You have very little control over the broad culture. You can't control the books and the movies and the music, right? It's going to be good or bad or worse, but you can't do anything about it. All you can do is filter it as it comes into your corporate culture. But both of those meanings are not really significant until you think about the third meaning of culture, which is the petri dish. Do you remember when you were in school and you had that little round dish of yellow Jell-O? That was called a culture. Why? Because you put something in there like bacteria, and then you grow your bacteria if your culture is good. If your culture is not good, if it's antiseptic or toxic, you won't grow what you're trying to grow. The culture will grow stuff. That's why we say cultivate, right? The purpose of culture is to grow something. Well, what are you growing? I would argue that if you want to grow an awareness of identity, you attend to those things which strengthen your understanding of who you are based on code and creed. Well, you've got your habits. How do you do stuff? You've got your liturgy, but in the large sense, what are the rituals you have of life? At what time in the morning do you drink your coffee? And how exactly do you make? I mean, it's almost liturgical in a way. It is religion for some people. Songs and poems. For the most part, songs have been a tremendous way to transfer cultural understanding of code and creed from generation to generation. And when we lose the tradition, we lose the transmission of the culture. Prayers, if you are so inclined to memorize prayers. If you're not, well, try some quotes. I have no objection myself to memorized prayers. Some people kind of do. They're like, no, memorized prayers are mechanical. It's empty repetition. I just want to talk to God. But I mean, there's times I don't really want to talk to God, but I know some prayers, I can say it, and guess what? My mind will conform to the memorized words. Scripture, very important if you're going to suffer for your faith. Stories, history, traditions, celebrations, all that stuff. But what happens when it's all stripped from you, right? And you've got no home to go to, and you've got no books to read, and you've got nothing except whatever you happen to be carrying around in your mind. You have to furnish your mind. Our children need to have their minds furnished with what? This kind of thing. Armando Velardes, in his book Against All Hope, the guy who was in Cuba for 20 years, he has a lot of little stories about how he accessed information and stories and memories and things that he was able to remind himself of and share with other people as well. In Rod Dreher's book, he interviewed people who spent time in Eastern European Soviet-era prisons. And what he found was that the people who did the best were the ones that knew enough scripture, enough of the story, enough that they could share that with others. So I picked 4 categories, and this is where I didn't know. So I polled my Facebook friends. I said, okay, let's start simple. We don't want to get overwhelming. It's got to be doable. If you're going to do something, you've got to start with a small step. So I said, what if you could memorize 5 songs, 5 prayers, 5 scripture selections, and knew 5 stories? Like if that was your goal, you could do that, couldn't you? You could memorize that. You could teach your children that. That's not overwhelming. If you get 5 down, 5 times 4, that's 20 things. Well, then add to it. But start reasonably. And you build those in. And those will create your appetites. And it gets all the way back to Theophan the Recluse. So here's my list. Facebook friends contributing. The top 5 songs: Be Thou My Vision, It Is Well With My Soul, Amazing Grace, My Anchor Holds. I do not know this song. Someone does, obviously. Faith of Our Fathers. Okay, you could learn these songs. You think about the early Christians who went to their death singing. They had to know some songs to be able to do that. I would be very happy to go to my death as a martyr singing a song, if I knew one. I'm the kind of guy who probably knows like the first 3 lines, so I just have to sing the first 3 lines again and again. But why not all the verses, right? Set goals. How about 5 scripture selection? Well, this is tough. You have to figure this out for yourself. But Facebook friends, the Beatitudes, that's so beautiful. 2 Corinthians, all about persecution. One line, you will be hated for my name's sake. There was a lot of debate about which Psalms were the most important. And then I think, if you couldn't do anything except maybe 9 or 10 words, that would be the best one. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. How better could you conform your suffering to the mind of Christ than to say the words that Christ said? And you got to say, it'd be really hard to forgive people who are torturing you. 5 prayers, if you don't like memorized prayers, you could go with Sam's speech from Lord of the Rings. That's a pretty good thing to have memorized there. The Lord's Prayer, Apostles' Creed, Anima Christi, Soul of Christ, Sanctify me, Body of Christ, Save me. I have experimented with memorizing prayers in Latin while sitting in the sauna, because it's kind of as close to hell as I get on a daily basis. It's really hot, like 190 degrees. And it's very interesting. The time goes by faster. The suffering is lessened as I have recited this relatively small selection of prayers I have memorized in Latin. Sometimes people look at me a little oddly. And stories. Stories are tremendously important. I divided them into 2 categories. Stories for children, and this was the Facebook Friends poll. Aesop Fables, Chronicles of Narnia, Lord of the Rings, Green Ember series, and the stories of martyrs. And that's about all I have right now. I'm still developing some ideas here, but hopefully it's given you some food for thought. And again, with God, all things are possible. There could be a revival, there could be a transformation, there could be any number of good things could happen. But if we are aware of history, we would also be aware that any number of very bad things could happen. And just because we happen to be feeling safe and comfortable in our Christianity right here and now, it does not mean that that will not be tested. So, on that cheerful note, I hope that we will, again, be able to get together and share ideas as we all strive to become the best version of ourselves so that we can serve the Lord Jesus Christ forever. Thank you.